I hope I can live up to some of those words. I've been so inspired similarly by Renee. We just love every time we get to converse. And being here on this campus the last 4 days has been just marvelous. It's been such a privilege for me to see the growth and the flowering of this place and see the children and get to know the teachers a little bit and the wonderful human beings who are here. Do you hear enough of what I just said? I was just glorifying Rainbow Mountain. So I'm a collector of definitions of spirituality. And that's an interesting thing to collect because some people feel it's a little like collecting butterflies. If you try to capture what spirituality means, it's like pinning it down and taking the life out of it, and it's hard to define. But I hope I don't do that. I hope that I just observe the butterflies, the definitions in their natural habitats, and then just try to catch a flavor of them. So recently, just to give you a flavor of this in everyday life, I had two little experiences. I was at a potluck supper for my condo association in Vermont, and I was sitting next to a woman I didn't know very well, and she said, "What have you been doing lately?" And I said, "I just got back from a conference in Quebec City." And she said, "What was the conference on?" I said, "Well, it was on children's spirituality." And she got this kind of funny look on her face, and she said, "Oh, you mean religion?" And I said, "Well, some people were coming from the perspective of religion, but many were coming from other perspectives, just people who are interested in spirituality." And she said, "Oh, okay, I am an atheist Unitarian, and I have a perspective on spirituality." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "I see it as caring for other people." So that was just a lovely, quick definition of, as you'll see, one of the categories that has come up in my research. And then I was walking on a bike path near my house, and it opens up to this amazing view of a river in one direction and a lake in the other and mountains. And a woman two people actually had stopped bike riding and were talking, and then I just overheard a woman saying, "This is my spirituality. Just look. I feel so connected." So she was talking about what I will call an ecological approach. So I listen for those, but also I've done very deliberate research. So the word spirituality started coming up in educational circles a lot, about 30 years ago. And it came up more and more frequently. I once gave a workshop, and it was for public school middle educators. It was way back then, on spirituality and education. People just kind of snuck in the door, like, "I'm afraid who's going to see me here?" They would say, "It's like coming out of the closet. Do we dare even talk about this in education?" And then I said, "Yeah, people are talking about it, but they mean different things, and I want to know what they mean." And so that's my obsession. So that's what I've been doing for a very long time. So my research is based on really hundreds of interviews, maybe even as many as 1,000 surveys on what spirituality means to educators, their beliefs and experiences with integrating it into education. So the questions that I ask are, well, what does the word spiritual mean to you? And then what does it mean to you in terms of education? And it can be parent education or school education. So I'm just going to ask you to I'm going to just let you do this for about 2 minutes, but would you turn and talk to one or two other people? Just a very, very brief answer to this question. What are the first words that come to your mind when you think of spirituality, and how do you or would you bring them into your form of education? I'll ring the bell in 2 minutes. So at this point, after many years of doing this kind of work, I have 12 categories of different ways of framing spirituality. So I'm going to show you those categories and see how what you were just talking about fits in. And later I'll say more about the categories, so you'll be able to see more about what I mean and what you mean. But I may learn from you. Someone may contact me after this and say, you know what, I have a different view. I don't think it quite fit where you were talking. And I'll say, oh, can I interview you? So we'll see how that goes. So if there's a lot, it's fairly small words. I'm not going to read these right now. I'm going to go through them one at a time in just a minute and explain a little bit more about what I mean. So, but under each of these categories, there are a number of what I call capacities, and those are attitudes, skills, or capabilities. You could think of them as developmental possibilities. And so each of these is rooted in developmental theory. I'm not giving you the developmental theory today. I'm working on a very, very long book. So there's so much detail around this that I didn't put the details of the developmental theory in it, but if you're interested in particular one, I can talk to you. And so these capacities or developmental possibilities in each category may diminish or complexify with age. Some of them we come with, such as what I'll talk about as wonder and awe, which are part of the emotional capacities, and those we have to protect so they don't go away with age. Others, such as moral reasoning, which I also include in my system, we need to really help children develop those, that those develop along with our cognitive stages. So, but I am assuming that each can be educated, and I don't mean formal education necessarily. Some of them, there might be formal techniques, but also educated in the way of being led out, educar, to be led out. And ultimately, yes, they all flow together. So we have separate categories, and you'll see how they all connect. We just kind of pull them apart gently, tease them apart, so that we can get a clear picture. But we understand that they really do all connect. So just a little bit more about spiritual capacities. We could say that these 12 perspectives offer a framework for a spiritual education curriculum. Now, by curriculum, I do not mean something formal, like a formal written document. It could be. That may be what someone decides to do. But I mean an informal or an informal plan. And even as a parent, we don't have a written curriculum, but we have a plan in our minds for what we're going to do with our children, where we want them to grow and develop. A key that I'm not talking about too much specifically through all these is that it's really important to be allowing ourselves to develop each of these capacities in ourselves. So we teach who we are, we all know that. So this isn't separate from children's development, but children in many cases are furthering our spiritual development. That's probably why I became an educator, because as a researcher, I went out to schools and I just got hooked on young children's energy. It was just like almost a drug for me. They're so alive and they're so full of wonder, so wonderful. And then another point is that no one can do it all. So this is a little overwhelming, all of the capacities, and I don't want anyone to think, oh my gosh, how am I going to fit all of that in? No one can do it all. So as I talk about these perspectives, I'm just going to invite you not to, if you want to take notes, feel free, but of details, but just, kind of take out some paper and just scratch down some things that invite you or call to you or puzzle you or interest you or challenge you that you might want to return to later on. And I have to warn you, this is a very I warned Renee, I said, this is a very information-rich presentation. I'm going to be giving you lots of information. So, but if you come at it with a personal perspective, I think it will be, I hope it will be not too much. So I have to say, just a note, I'm going to start with talking about religious perspectives, but so a note about that is that a lot of people try to separate them completely, and you really can't, because they both deeply engage with ideas and experiences that about human origin, purpose, and meaning. For religious implies a more specific context. So in a particular community with a particular spiritual belief system, this is where I develop. Spirituality is a much more open concept, and it's usually looking at probably 1,000 definitions. Everyone's trying to define it in a general way. It's almost always defined as connections with something greater than self. It could be God, could be our deep inner self, it could be other people or the world, and I'm sure that's come up for you many times. So what are some of these religious capacities? For some people, it really does mean sensing and feeling a particular prophet or deity or the ground of being. And other people who, like my new friend I just told you about, who said she's an atheist, that part is not relevant at all. But if you're in a serious religious community, there's something more, something underlying that your religion is trying to help you access. But it also means participating in community spiritual practices and rituals. And so just about every school has a community, and it has a shared belief system that can be imparted through a ritual that children participate in, feel a community connection, even if it's not a formal religion. So it means articulating the symbols and belief systems of that particular religion, so really understanding what that religion offers. And always there's some kind of ethical responsibility attached to that religious system. And then understanding, comparing belief systems of multiple religions. So a couple of quotations from teachers in my study that really fit into this category. At school, I don't talk about my religion, but I try to live it in everything I say and do. Or another teacher said, children have a right to learn about the world's religions, what they teach, and their place in history and culture, both negative and positive. So here I've put up, just derived from what I just said, just some of the ways that we might be thinking about how to educate religious capacities. So participating in those practices and rituals that connect us, if it's a religious kind of school, either to a particular belief system, or if it's not, to the community. Learning about beliefs of one religious group or more than one. In the U.S., of course, we don't have required religion. I spend a lot of time at conferences in Europe and Great Britain where children all study religion. It's part of the school curriculum. And so there's a feeling here that children need this. A lot of children are deprived of this. They don't know what that possibility is or what the impact on culture, both positive and negative, have been. So moving on to, and I divided the contemplative up into two different categories. So by contemplative, we mean a kind of knowing that's inner, that's in contrast to rational knowing. It's very countercultural now because we have such an exteriorized, media-driven, fast, technological, instant kind of culture. But by secular, I mean aspects of it that do not assume the existence of a non-material world. So, and this is, we might recognize as the current mindfulness context. So some of the capacities would be developing things like focusing attention, holding presence, being aware with all of our senses, being really tuned in and sensitive to other people, being able to calm down, to increase our inner calm when we need it, and then just deep reflection about, academic subjects or anything, not just a quick memorization of ideas, but really deep reflection on the meaning. That's all what I call contemplative secular. Contemplative mystical does assume that there's some kind of deeper reality not based on the senses, that I have a direct connection with something, a ground of being or Allah or God or inner light. And so in that sense, there's an experiential probing of the mysteries of life and death. And in some educational contexts, it's really possible to do this, and in others, it isn't. It's not, or with one's belief system, it doesn't fit. So a couple of quotes from teachers. Spirituality is a connection with an all-encompassing power or light or being or energy. It is important for me to stay connected with it and to recognize it in my students. If all I can do is give my students 5 minutes of silence where they can tune into their inner lives, I am helping them develop spiritually. So, for this, I just made a list. There are so many ways that we could approach educating, actually this is supposed to say both secular and mystical contemplative qualities. I just combined them. They'll be very familiar to you, I think, giving opportunities for silence, quiet, solitude, concentration practices, deep reflecting exercises both by self and with others, work on breath meditation that might go into a very deep, breath work that might go into a very deep meditation. And we've already mentioned sensory awareness, observing our thought processes, learning to relax, and doing some bodily-based disciplines. So another one, faith capacities. And a lot of times when you hear the word faith, you associate it with a religion. And that's one possible way of thinking about it, but I'm thinking in a more general sense today. The world we live in does not encourage children to have faith. It's a very shaky ground that we're on now. Most of us think in so many just different ways in the what's happening to the earth and what's happening in terms of our moral behavior. So to educate faith means to create, the capacities are to have a strong trust or conviction in someone or something, to hold that conviction despite challenges, because we'll be challenged all the time, and having a basic belief in the goodness of people, the goodness in the world, the goodness of self, again, despite evidence to the contrary in general. And it could include a belief in God or Allah, a ground of being, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And so I love this recent campaign called Because of Them We Can, showing children who are taking on as role models famous moral figures that give them faith. In this case, it was Nelson Mandela and Susan Anthony. A teacher's words, I want my students to leave my classroom believing the world is basically a good place, even if much of their previous life experience has given them a cynical view of life. I sort of put it right into great words. So, just following from all that, this is just a few things out of many we could list. How would you educate faith capacities? Being that person, always trying to be that person that children can trust, and we'll all fail and work again to rebuild trust. We're not perfect. Just constantly trying to see the good in every child, despite some instances that stray, that all of us have. And then there's so much bad news in the world, so continually offering examples of good news. And I've already mentioned diverse role models, heroes. Some of my children like to, instead of saying heroines, like to call them sheroes. Heroes and sheroes, always being held up. So another category is meaning-making or existential capacities. And theoretically, we're doing this in all educational systems, but it so often gets left out. We're on the surface. We're not going into the depth of the different academic disciplines. What is science really trying to teach us about the world? How can it be taught meaningfully? Or math, or you could say about any discipline. And reflecting on the big questions in life, including making sure you include those in the curriculum, and just constantly attuning to one's own life. Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? What's the purpose of my life? So, a teacher's words, my spiritual life is my search for the meaning of life in whatever form it takes. Often it involves more questions than answers. If I can encourage my children to keep asking questions, then I feel I am furthering their spirituality. So just a few examples of how we might educate those meaning-making capacities. So active student engagement in the disciplines, not just superficial work, but actual probing and being allowed to ask and follow interesting questions, including philosophy, even at a young age. So there are these approaches called philosophy for children. Even very young children love to talk about the nature of death, or why are the stars twinkling? And they're science, but they're also deep questions. Where's the light coming from? Why did my dog die? And of course, we already talked about including religions. But that idea that the teacher captured, putting questions at the center, children's questions. So another one of the perspectives is self-reflective capacities. And again, we're theoretically focusing on this all the time in every educational system, but often not at a depth level. What do I know about my own motives, thoughts, and emotions? Can I assess my strengths and weaknesses? What are my talents? And another part of this in the current culture is, can I understand and control the impact of technology on my life? It's one of the huge questions that we're all facing as educators that has to be built into the self-reflective educational system. Where am I going in life? Why do I feel so conflicted? Do I have a sense of self-respect? It's like I'm missing the quotation. Spirituality, one teacher said, spirituality is our connection to a greater purpose beyond ourselves that is hidden in ourselves. Spiritual education, then, is helping learners understand themselves, find their own purpose, follow their bliss, chase their star, become who they were meant to be. So how do we educate self-reflective capacities? So really allowing children to self-assess, to understand what their particular styles of learning are and how can they best approach their learning. Start letting them think from an early age of what are they really good at and what do they want to develop. Usually this approach includes a lot of self-reflective writing as well as thinking, journaling, and then we already mentioned the idea of mastering the media in yourself, not just the kind of superficial media skills. Emotional capacities includes a very, very wide range of developmental possibilities. Some we come with and some we need to develop, as we've said. So I've already mentioned wonder, awe, gratitude, openness, and fluidity, the ability to love deeply, the ability to engage with the world with curiosity, to perceive and understand and regulate our own emotions and calm our emotional stress. So, a teacher's words, spirituality is a sense of wonder, awe, appreciation, and love for our universe and all creatures in it. It infuses me with excitement for learning, for exploring, for sharing, and for encouraging these in my students. These are just some possible suggestions. And one of the things that I think I didn't say in the beginning, but now as this list is getting longer and heavier, I think that you're recognizing you probably already have included many of these, that you're already thinking about many of these in your curriculum. That's just kind of a way to check in, see what we think we're really doing well to develop a spiritual child and where we need to focus a little more. How are we sparking curiosity? How are we allowing or enhancing wonder and awe? How are we really identifying and developing students' particular interests and talents? And connecting, a deep, sincere connection with children, a relationship with them. I'm sure that that's the basis of everyone here's emotional curriculum. Creating that calm, friendly, engaged, happy classroom, and specific programs for educating emotional literacy, which are very common now. So social and peacemaking capacities are related, and everyone's talking about how social skills seem to be diminishing because of so much time on screens now. So this is a particular area, and not everyone would call this spiritual development, but I think it's at the heart of spiritual development. How do we help children communicate clearly and thoughtfully and respectfully, engage in caring relationships, respect values and differences from others, resist prejudice, and be able to use conflict resolution? So a teacher's words, all major religions have a golden rule about the way others should be treated. Helping my students understand, feel, and act on this is the most spiritual aspect of my teaching. So a related one is ethical and moral capacities. It's a little different. It overlaps with social and peacemaking, but it has a slightly more cognitive component. So developing that inner moral code rationally that governs our relationship, having it become more complex as we grow older, and then acting responsibly on those values. A teacher's words, spirituality is the way I approach the world with my moral judgment and values. It is who I am and how I relate to my world. In terms of my teaching, my spirituality is apparent in my every action, how I treat myself and others, the kind of climate I create in my classroom. There's just some out of many suggestions of approaching this. Our classrooms then become a laboratory. So children are living out their ethical issues in their relationships. We're actually highlighting ethical issues in all areas of the curriculum. So you can always find the moral issues in science and in literature and even in math, so on, that can be brought forward. There's so many programs these days for direct teaching of social skills and conflict resolution. And of course, service learning and multicultural curriculum, an anti-bias curriculum, and social justice action. These can just be buzzwords, but to take them all very, very seriously is quite an undertaking. So, creative capacities. When my daughter was about 3 years old, she was in a very, very large sand pile. It wasn't a formal sandbox, and she found a stick, and she made this huge, huge stick figure of a person. And when she got done, she said, "Now I know why God created the world." She loved that creativity so much. And so, and some people call our creativity kind of our most godlike quality. So it's to be able to use our own talents and imagination to express something about the world, acting innovatively, using our imagination, and then just playfulness and humor. Those are all part of creative capacities. Well, teacher's words, to me, spirituality is the creativity of the universe or God or whatever you call it. I'm most spiritual when I tap into this creativity, and as a teacher, I try to set up my classroom as a creative place and to find the ways that each student is the most creative. So how do we educate creative capacities? Everybody, you could say everyone has gifts. Everyone is a gift to the world. So we have one lifetime to really develop and give it. How do we help students do that? Multiple intelligences become a buzzword. How do we help students encourage them to share their knowledge in multiple ways, no matter what subject we're teaching? So this always has to include time for active player experimentation at any age, whether it's experimenting with materials or ideas. And then learning, I find it extremely valuable to include learning about the creative process for individuals in every single discipline. What is a creative mathematician? What is a creative social scientist? And so, as you'll see, I don't actually have art specifically here. I did once, I combined creative and arts, but then I realized, no, creativity is in our life. Anything we do can be creative. It really is not specific to the arts, and so that's why I created, out of what I was hearing and reading, I created another category. I'm calling it aesthetic and artistic capabilities. So to be able to appreciate beauty in many forms and to contemplate objects with senses and emotions, not just with the intellect. And then to use all the artistic forms, the varied artistic forms, and then not only to have aesthetic experiences, but to let them shape our ethical behavior. How does beauty and moral behavior connect? What do they have to do with each other, or sometimes not? So following from that, how might we educate aesthetic and artistic capacities? So including exposure to many, many beautiful places and beauty in all cultures. And including when we look at the cultures, seeing how our social valuing and our racial bias has impacted what's considered beautiful. Really sort of helping children to see that people have different ways of seeing beauty. Giving children opportunities in all the artistic mediums and then letting them develop the ones that they're the most interested in. So this is the last one, in case you're getting a little weary of all these words. But in a sense, you could say I saved it for last because in some ways, right now, it may be the most important perspective. We are living in what many people call a burning world. That's no news to you. And there certainly are so many programs that have been started about ecological sustainability for that reason. People are waking up to it, and yet it doesn't really hold a center place necessarily in most educational systems. And this is very embodied. How do we understand and respect our own bodies? How do we physically relate to the world? We're part of the earth. We're growing out of the earth. How do we use all our senses to engage with the world and really perceive that everything is interconnected? Do we have a sense of place, a personal connection? And do we take responsibility for and productive action towards reattaining ecological balance? So this quotation really kind of got it all in there. Spirituality is my awareness that I'm part of a bigger universe, that we are all connected to every part of the universe, including all life forms, all humans, all cultures throughout time. As a teacher, I can inspire kids to do things for the good of others, for the good of the earth. I can model being a respectful person who understands limits and limitations. How do we educate ecological capacities? And everything here just follows from what we've said about what the capacities are. So allowing an emphasis on sensory awareness and embodiedness. Many experiences in nature, both free range and planned. Direct teaching of ecological principles. There's so much good curriculum out there. Age-appropriate discussion. So when do you decide to talk about the latest issue in terms of contamination of a particular river system near your home? Maybe when children bring it up, or do you wait till a certain age? Just kind of feeling that out. But always, whenever something arises, giving an action. What can I do to mitigate this? So I'm coming to the end of what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to have you talk a little bit about this, but just a few things. So why create these categories when they all flow together? That would be one question. So I hope that you've gotten a flavor of why I think it's important to do that, and I'm sure as I was going through this, you could see many ways that they connected. But for me, it helps, before we put them all back together, to think about them separately. Why use the word, then why use the word spiritual at all? So that's another one. Why don't I just call them, use those 12 names? And I think that that's perfectly fine, and in many contexts that works. But there is something about the word spiritual that is a container that draws out what each person thinks is kind of some of the highest values and the deepest purposes about human life. So now the question I'm going to put to you is, did they help you think about the ways you already educate? Did they spark your thinking about something that you want to include? And how? And then, do you have questions? So I'd like you to get back together with the same person or include different people and return to that conversation that you had in the very beginning. How did this relate to what you wrote down when you first started? And what can you congratulate yourself on about what you're doing well? What direction might you want to go in? So I'm going to give you about 8 minutes to do this, or I'll see, maybe five to 8 minutes. So I am going to allow the great ecological educator Rachel Carson to have my final words, but then we have a few minutes, so after that, I'm going to see if anyone would be willing to maybe say, if it has a question or has a couple of words that they'd like, a little bit they'd like to share with everyone about that last discussion that you just had. So, a child's world is fresh and new and beautiful, full of wonder and excitement. It's our misfortune that for most of us, that clear-eyed vision, that true instinct for what is beautiful and awe-inspiring is dimmed and even lost before we reach adulthood. If I had the influence with the good fairy, I should ask that her gift to each child in the world would be a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life as an unfailing antidote against boredom and disenchantment of later years, the alienation from the source of our strength.